Big Brother's always watching, looking for its next victim. Will you get lost in the system, or can you survive where others could not? The Little Nightmares franchise has grown in popularity over the years. There are so many things to love about these games. Well fleshed out characters, bone-chilling atmosphere, and a unique cryptic storytelling style. All these components elevate the games to new heights. Streamlined stories can help players stay on track, although subtle open-ended stories can also be powerful. A vague narrative often leaves more room for discussion and speculation. I want to discuss a new theory I've been crafting for the Little Nightmares universe. To be clear, this doesn't have anything to do with my other theories thus far. If you want to check out one of my other theory videos, links are in the description down below. Also, as a quick tangent, I'd like to say thanks so much for all the love and support on this channel so far. It's been really fun to engage with you all in the comments. I can't put into words how much I appreciate it, so thank you. I've been thinking a lot about the games and what the imagery means. Then it hit me. Little Nightmares has a striking resemblance to one of my favorite pieces of literature, 1984 by George Orwell. These two creative works have so much to say about the psychology of control, the power of media, and our consumptive habits. To prepare for this video, I reread 1984 by George Orwell and also Terror, Love, and Brainwashing by Alexander Stein. I finally played Very Little Nightmares, which has been on my to-do list. So today I'd like to break down the psychology in these two pieces of media and see what it means for the Little Nightmares universe. I'm Very. If you enjoyed this content, like, subscribe, and share with your friends. It really helps with the growth of this channel, and I'd really appreciate it. In order to understand the imagery in Little Nightmares, we need to analyze the story of 1984. For those of you who have already read the book, or who aren't interested, I'll try and leave timestamps to skip to the next section of the video. However, I will talk about some connections to the game in this section as well. This is also a difficult book to break down because of the complex themes and imagery, so I'll try my best, but I'm sure there are important things that I'll miss. 1984 starts with the introduction of the main character, Winston Smith. He is a bitter man, sick of living in the dystopian place known as Oceania. The story begins with Winston purchasing a journal and writing April 1984. Having individual thought and writing things down are crimes of the highest degree. Winston knows this, but keeps the journal anyways. In this world, everything is under control. The ruling party in Oceania is INGSOC, or the English Socialist Party. It's important to remember, despite the name, the universe of 1984 is more akin to fascism. INGSOC uses the image of Big Brother, a fictional icon, to inspire the people of Oceania. This party has three tiers: the inner party, the party, and the proles. The two parties work together to control the proles. Nothing gets past Big Brother. INGSOC established a 24/7 surveillance state, using televisions and other technology that have recording devices in them. The best way to elicit complete control is to have access to all the information. Any semblance of dissent was punishable by death. INGSOC made even the thought of committing a crime punishable, giving birth to the term thought crime. They also invented a new language called Newspeak. This is a more simplified version of language, which would reduce the amount of unique thoughts a person can have. I'd like to eat butter toast has a very different sentiment than I'd like food. If people have less words and thoughts available to them, rebellions become non-existent. By manipulating people to this extent, it's very easy to exert psychological control over a population. For example, a common practice in the book is rewriting history. This in turn causes the population to lose touch with reality to some extent. We would like to think that in this scenario, we could still remember important events or times in our lives, but these are often a product of our environment. Usually when we interact with stimuli, our brains process this information and it goes into our short-term memory. Like remembering a phrase, for example, mono means one. If this information is significant enough, then it will transcribe onto our long-term memory. Memories can last here for years, but it's not unlimited. Our brains will get rid of the memories that are less important. These memories are crucial, and they make up who we are. Who would you be without the most important moments in your life? In Little Nightmares, we can see this with the people captivated by televisions. They are consumed with the screen, always engaging with it mindlessly. No faces, no persons. Only an amalgamation of controlling thought. Such pervasive control the institution has that its citizens will happily throw their lives away. Back to 1984. In Oceania, there are different sects of government tasked with different jobs. The Ministry of Truth, which concerns itself with news, entertainment, education, and the fine arts. The Ministry of Peace, which concerned itself with war. The Ministry of Love, which maintained law and order. And the Ministry of Plenty, which was responsible for economic affairs. These four branches dictate reality for the citizens in Oceania. For example, Winston, who works for the Ministry of Truth. His job is to rewrite and destroy all pieces of history. The work crushes his soul, but he finds sweet relief in the puzzling elements of it. This type of control is exceptionally pernicious because it can gaslight citizens. Gaslighting is when you have someone question their own sanity or reality by manipulating them. For example, an abusive person might lie to their partner, so much that they begin to question whether a certain event happened. In Oceania, the government would rewrite its own facts so much that they became meaningless. How do you know the government is lying too if they already rewrote the lie? Winston fears Ingsoc, so he tries to keep his nose to the grindstone, constantly wearing a mask if you will, to never show cracks in the facade. Showing disdain in an expression is considered a face crime in 1984. Even though he hates the government, he can't let it show. But one day, something peculiar happened. One of his co-workers that he finds attractive seems to take interest in him. Winston initially suspected this mysterious woman of being a member of the Thought Police. This organization's goal is to snoop out for potential crimes and report them to Big Brother. Winston runs into an old man at the bar and asks him about life before Big Brother. Winston was young when Ingsoc took over, so life before their control was a mystery to him. The old man was no help to him, so he went to a nearby shop. He conversates with the shopkeeper, learning tidbits of information about the past. Then he bought a piece of coral, preserved in some glass. For some reason, the coral was a remnant of the past he needed to possess. Big Brother would not look kindly to this act, so Winston put the coral in his pocket. On the way home, he happened to run into the woman at his work again. He can't tell whether or not she was a spy, but he found her very attractive. Time skips forward, and they meet again because she injured her arm. Winston helps her, but she leaves abruptly. The next day at work on his desk, he gets a message that says, "I love you." As with everything else in 1984, love and meaningful sexual intercourse are expressly forbidden. Winston is thrown off the rest of the day. He craves physicality and wants to get into contact with the elusive woman. This proves to be rather challenging given the circumstances. Eventually they meet in a hideout in secrecy. She reveals to Winston that her name is Julia and that she's been playing the part to stay under the radar. She leads anti-sex classes and helps spread propaganda throughout Oceania. One thing that is worth mentioning is this is true for both characters. Even though both characters despise the party, they are performatively party members. The system they inhabit compulses them to do things they don't want to. This is also true in Little Nightmares. Mono and Six have to do cruel things to progress the plot. They might fight against the systems of control in place, but both characters ultimately succumb to the context they are in. Having all these mechanisms in place allow for complete psychological control of the characters. It's hard to know what's real when facts are meaningless. It becomes easier to swallow propaganda when you're inundated with it. Julia and Winston's characters are important in this way, because they don't immediately get consumed by the system in place. Most blindly follow the instructions of the party, but these two rebel. After they hook up, Winston and Julia have a hard time seeing each other for a while because of the constant patrolling. As time goes on, their love for one another deepens. The storekeeper lets them rent his upstairs room for their sexual needs. They find solace in this hellscape by creating a bond with one another. I think this bond is similar in Little Nightmares. Six and Mono only seem to have a sense of comfort by each other's presence, but slowly they are torn apart. The system is following its design to isolate and indoctrinate, take away any sense of meaning or happiness, to create an amalgamation of ideas of the party. As Winston and Julia continue to see each other, their lives improve. Although this happiness is short-lived, Big Brother is always watching. They talked about Goldstein's politics and such, Goldstein being the infamous rebel who tried to stand up to the party. People speculate about his whereabouts after trying to rebel. There are many rumors that Goldstein still has some political pull, and that a new rebellion could start soon. Even though Winston and Julia are rebels, they understand the world very differently. Winston is more cynical and aware of the broader issues at hand, whereas Julia is more upbeat and understands the inner workings of the party. One day, Winston is contacted by O'Brien. He is a member of the inner party, and he wants to talk to Winston about the technicalities of Newspeak. The conversation goes on and takes an unexpected turn. O'Brien turns off all electronics and speaks with Winston and Julia. They suspected that he might be a rebellion member, and throw themselves at his mercy. O'Brien asks if they are willing to do anything to take down Ingsoc. The only thing they won't sacrifice is the love they have for one another. O'Brien tells him that Winston will be contacted shortly. Things come to a boil in Oceania when it turns out that the information given out before was inaccurate. Goldstein planted fake information to start a riot. Because of the war-torn, poverty-stricken environment of Oceania, something of this caliber would likely start a riot. During this distraction, Winston receives Goldstein's book. This causes havoc at work, tireless hours, victory coffee to survive. Eventually, all remnants of the gaff were erased. Winston finally gets to read Goldstein's book. In it, he deconstructs the inner workings of hierarchies and their necessity. Big Brother's perpetuation of war is intentional, because it gives a reason to withhold supplies, to have money flow without output behind it. He also explains how science is detached from reality now. Goldstein talks about the entire process being a mechanical system. If we think about the context of the games, we have constant machine imagery, but also the designs of the map, especially in the Maw, feel by design. There are always perfectly cut out paths the player follows, only one path forward, working inside of this mechanical system, progressing the machine as we head down the path of fate. There are two things the party hopes to accomplish. First is to get into people's minds, and the second is to kill massive amounts of people on short notice. Hold on to these two tenets because they will be important later on. Similar to fascism, Goldstein talks about how nations need to otherize one another. Another important idea Goldstein brings up is the notion of 2 + 2 = 4. This concept is necessary for the current system to exist. A plane in 1984's universe couldn't be constructed without an understanding of mathematics. This is also true for the universe of Little Nightmares as well. The Maw was a boat turned into a killing machine. The school and hospital, which were intended for learning and healing, now disseminate propaganda and partake in human experimentation. This is where the first slogan of Big Brother comes in. War is peace. Waging battles and otherizing groups of people eventually make war meaningless. It's not war if there's no end in sight, rather a normal occurrence. In the next section, Goldstein talks about the constant battle between the different classes, upper, lower, and middle. The interests of these groups were in direct conflict with one another. So to unify the groups, they sold a false sense of collectivization to make the wealth disparity seem more digestible. This new brand of ruling class knew how to manipulate the other classes. We learn more about doublethink, the idea of being able to hold two conflicting positions. Goldstein talks about how the institutions themselves are contradictory. The Ministry of Love uses torture and hate. The Ministry of Truth uses lies and deception. This to me resembles the school. The teacher indoctrinates its students with hate and misinformation. Whenever a student sees Mono, they attack. This is because fear is instilled into the students. Winston and Julia have a peaceful nap, but calamity strikes when they least expect it. A voice calls out to them. Behind a picture was a telescreen they weren't aware of. The state captures them both. Winston wakes up in a cell, alongside other criminals. In this prison, forced labor helps Big Brother achieve its ends. As Winston stays in the Ministry of Love, he tries to find a way out. He found out one of his co-workers is also in the facility. Parsons was an oaf and swallowed propaganda wholeheartedly, but in his sleep, he says down with Big Brother. He was imprisoned by his own child, who turned him into the state. Once Parson left the cell, another person came in, which horrified Winston. He had heard rumors of Room 101, and wondered if this was its outcome. The man looked emaciated and disheveled. His suspicions were confirmed when the man begged not to go back to that room. O'Brien then visits him to let Winston know that he was caught too. He claims that Winston knew O'Brien was in on it the whole time, which was true now that he thought back on it. Then his torture began. Guards and scientists analyzed his every reaction as they beat him. At one point, Winston felt like he jumped into a luminous eye when he was strapped to a chair surrounded by lights. Then the indoctrination and gaslighting began. O'Brien, leading this torture, explains that Winston is ill and needs readjustment. Everything he saw in the past was wrong and was a delusion of sorts, with the explicit goal of having Winston question his sanity. O'Brien says the party is the only thing that controls reality. He continues with the torture, escalating to electroshock. Then he questions Winston and asks what 2 + 2 =. Winston says 4. O'Brien then inquires, what if the party says 2 + 2 = 5? Giving the wrong answer, Winston is shocked again. When he gives a semi-acceptable answer, then he's administered drugs to make him feel good. This type of psychological manipulation is called operant conditioning. For Winston, answers that support the party are encouraged, and dissenting opinions are punished. By reinforcing certain behaviors and discouraging others, you're limiting their capacity to act. This psychological manipulation changes the way we interact with the world. The main character of 1984 is horrified to answer anything besides 5, because of fear of repercussions. Even the thoughts themselves disappear because of the negative stimulus. O'Brien insinuates that Winston is a flaw in the system. He then tells Winston that he wrote Goldstein's book in a shocking twist. As the torture continues, Winston breaks under the pressure of the system. His mind was acclimated to the brainwashing, but his emotions were not, so they sent him to Room 101. Here they use a person's truest fears to break them. In Winston's case, the fear of rats burrowing into his head caused him to betray the one thing he held onto, Julia. Then time skips forward, and Winston's life goes back to usual. He no longer works directly in the party, only helps them occasionally. The ex-couple ran into each other one day. Winston and Julia realize that they no longer have love for one another. 1984 ends with the main character singing praises for Big Brother. A system set up to control reality succeeded with another radicalization. Winston became part of the system, a new pawn to be used by the party. So now that we've gone over the plot of 1984, let's see how well this maps onto Little Nightmares. To apply this to Little Nightmares, we have to lay out the groundwork for this theory. I think that there is a time loop in the game series, shown in the ending of the second game, where Mono turns into the Thin Man. Mono going through time to become something he is seemingly running from. An inescapable destiny, if you will. In my theory, I'm also assuming that Six is the lady. There is lots of contextual evidence for this argument. Six is constantly surrounded by mirrors. In the comics, she falls into the lady's mask. In the dream world, Six has a music box that looks like the Maw and wallpaper similar to the lady's quarters. The Maw and hospital are also connected in my theory. The faces of the guests at the Maw have an uncanny resemblance to the masks in the hospital. So it's possible the guests at the Maw were sent to the hospital for their bodies to be used. I believe the World of Little Nightmares could be thought of as a game world representation of the book. So now that we have the foundation for this theory, let's talk about Little Nightmares in 1984. For this theory, I believe Mono is Winston and that Six is Julia. If we think about their characters, it makes a lot of sense. Mono and Six both fight against an oppressive force that compels them to do things they don't want to. Winston and Julia are very much the same. They are disgusted by the world, but in the end, perpetuate the systems they fought against. Let's expand on this a bit more, because this first claim is important to the theory. For Mono, I believe he represents Winston. He works in the Ministry of Truth, working as a propagandist. People who rewrite history, essentially control reality, and people's ability to think and act. If Mono were Winston, his plight throughout the second game seems similar. At first, he fights against the system, struggling to run away from fate. The Thin Man constantly chases him. But the system does what it's designed to do, break down our hero, make him question his sanity, traumatize him so much that he succumbs to the system. Winston was a master-class propagandist, and the same is seemingly true for the Thin Man. Then there's Six and her similarities to Julia. For one thing, there's constant rat imagery surrounding Six. I think that rats symbolize the idea of being trapped in a system. A rat in a trap, unable to escape its circumstances, waiting hopelessly for fate to change its course, but to no avail. Also, rats are a major fear for both Winston and Julia. The lady also represents what Julia wanted to be, free from the constraints of the party. She was always complaining to Winston about wanting to express her beauty and sexuality more. When she wears makeup for the first time, Winston is attracted to her because he talks about the whiteness of her makeup reminding him of a mask. Julia also feels guilty about running the anti-sex league. So if she were the lady, it could make sense that she wears a mask to distance herself from the harm. The couple promised O'Brien they would do anything for Goldstein's cause besides give up one another. The traumatizing scene in the second game when Six lets go of Mono could symbolize Julia at the end of the book. She gives up on Winston after an onslaught of torture. Her betraying Winston also allows Winston to betray her. If the time loop were real, it would make sense how they are perpetually harming one another. They both believe they can exert control over their lives. However, the system always wins. The first connection between 1984 and the World of Little Nightmares is that both pieces of media have a sense of linearity and structure. In the games, everything feels purposeful. The Maw is a perfect example. There are the depths, the main area, and the ladies' quarters. As we traverse this death boat, we can see the inner workings of the ship. Six always has a vague idea of where she is based on the background environments. In terms of linearity, the games have one set path forward. We the player are forced to do things we don't want to progress the narrative. Winston and Julia both had one set path to go down, given the context of this dystopian universe. Winston had to perpetuate Newspeak. Julia had to work for an anti-sex league. These characters were forced to do things against their will, because of the rules in place. Little Nightmares is the same. Six doesn't want to kill initially, but the desensitization of murder allows her to kill the gnome. The same can be said for Mono. When the TV plays initially, he holds his head like his brain is hurting. In the game, this is meant to show the loudness of the TV. But what if this is the propaganda captivating Mono's mind, hurting him at first because it doesn't make sense to him? But as the mechanisms of this world wear him down, the propaganda becomes more palatable. Structure is also important in regards to the enemies. 1984 has a very intricate composition. The inner party, the party, and the proles. Imagine this system like chess. The inner party is the king and queen, dictating the general trend and trajectory of Big Brother. Next comes the party. This includes non-pawn pieces, like the knight and rook. Their job is to perpetuate the systems in place. They must do whatever is necessary, under fear of repercussions. Then comes the proles or pawns. This group is allowed to do as it pleases, but it's also the most expendable of the three, unaware of the system, or how it impacts their perceptions of reality. In the games, the system of hierarchy seems to apply to the enemies too. The king and queen represent the thin man and the lady. The boss enemies represent the non-pawn pieces. They help perpetuate the system, but don't lead it. The chef runs the kitchen, but he doesn't run them all. That's left for the inner party, and the proles would be all of the other human NPCs. In the book, proles were used as cannon fodder, and forced to do labor against their will. Some examples are the gnomes, being used to power the maw, or the humans used as food. The oppressiveness of the system also scared the hell out of Winston and Julia. This could be thought of as the general atmosphere of the games too, illustrating the horrors of human cannibalization and the impacts of propaganda on the mind. The setting is very unnerving as well. All of the party and inter-party members are very comfortable being out in the open, yet they still hide behind a mask to some extent. The mask of Big Brother. This collective doing horrible things under the guise of what's best for the party, stripped of their autonomy and individuality. Big Brother is always watching. Speaking of watching, let's talk about surveillance and thought control. For one thing, Little Nightmares is filled to the brim with 1984 imagery, from the TVs to the eyes constantly watching, even the gameplay itself. Let's start with surveillance. One of the most nerve-wracking things about both of these universes is the idea of constantly being watched. This puts every character on edge. Winston and Julia feel uncomfortable. Mono and Six are seemingly scared. Eyes themselves often give us the impression of being spectated, always watching, analyzing, looking for the slightest ounce of dissent. Being seen means death. The gameplay choices also add to the feeling of being under a microscope. A slight misstep can mean death for the player. But what this does psychologically is put us on edge. This constant pressure on our backs might make us act differently than we might expect. Anxiety and fear can be powerful motivators. Think about one of the most intense sequences for you in Little Nightmares. I imagine if your experience is similar to mine, you feel anxious and uneasy, unsure of what to do next. What action is appropriate or acceptable? Especially in the intense scenes, the player might do something in the context of that environment we wouldn't normally do. To me, these design choices map perfectly onto 1984. We get a microcosm of what the characters in that universe felt in a completely different medium. But surveillance and gameplay aren't the only similarities. TVs in particular have a vast amount of significance in both pieces of media. The majority of Big Brother's messages were pushed through the television. There is a scene in the book where Winston must do his morning workout, and he feels so uncomfortable because he doesn't want to accidentally show dissent towards the party on his face. But if we contrast this with the ending of the book, he gets brainwashed by the messages on screen like everyone else in Oceania. Mono's character is so interesting for this very reason. He uses TVs to navigate the world, but they slowly captivate his mind. At first it seems like he struggles around the presence of the telescreen, but as time goes on, he gets more familiarized with the landscape. These media machines are also used as mind control in both mediums. In 1984, televisions were used to communicate and survey everyone and everything, but they are also used to push propaganda. The inner party can control the proles easily with a narrative on screen. Mono also has this ability. When he uses his power, he can cause people to go as far as throwing their own lives away. Propaganda can aid in psychological manipulation also. If we look at the televisions combined with Newspeak, the thoughts that the people can have can be greatly manipulated by televisions and other media apparatus. Once these thoughts become limited enough, we can only see amalgamations. People cease to be people, only faceless husks. Little Nightmares 2 shows us the pervasive impact that media has on its citizens. They freak out without a constant influx of propaganda. Faces morph with pain and anguish, unable to operate without a system constantly telling them what to do. This amalgamation of thought is best represented in the faces of the individuals consumed by the media. But what if the TVs were issuing out Big Brother's orders in the universe of Little Nightmares? The telescreens helped create a toxic culture in 1984 to rat on one another. They were encouraged to capture and detain or get rid of dissenters to the party. This is true in the games as well. The enemies in the games, especially the ones in front of TVs, seem almost ravenous at the idea of attacking you. The psychology of dehumanization and radicalization is complicated to say the least. When a single narrative is the only one you're interacting with, it can be easy to fall into a rabbit hole of thought. This was the intended design of the different sects of government in the book. These institutions dictated reality and were the pinnacles of psychological control. While I don't think all the institutions are literally in the game, several areas share similarities. Let's start with the Ministry of Truth. The job of this organization was to rewrite history and change people's perceptions of reality. If Mono were Winston, his impact on the world would probably represent this ministry. His ability to control reality helps him perpetuate and ultimately create the world of Little Nightmares. The school itself could be the Ministry of Love. Here propaganda is ushered out and creates mindless husks, but this is done through fear and torture. The Porcelain Children could be radicalized proles by the party. Mindless, no brains in their heads left to think. Left to their own accord, they go wild. But when a dominant authority figure comes in, they are ready for attention, unquestionably attacking those who are a threat to Big Brother. To understand this better, I want to break down how this reality manipulation works real fast. Say as an example, you display a picture of a rabbit. A rabbit is a relatively peaceful and non-dangerous animal to human beings. Obviously any animal can attack, but compared to other animals, your risk of harm near a bunny isn't too high. So how do you convince someone that a rabbit is a life-destroying animal? You would need to condition your population to fear the rabbit. In 1984, they did this with operant conditioning. This is a very explicit type of psychological behavioral modification. A good action or thought is rewarded, and a bad one is punished. Rat imagery is constant in both pieces of media. I believe this is because this type of conditioning is often tested on rats, and it also gives credence to the idea of a rat stuck in a trap, like a person caught in a system. He was electrocuted and tortured, but also injected with painkillers when he gave an answer that suited the party. It would make sense that a comparable tactic is used in Little Nightmares. Not to mention the students seem anxious and fearful of the teacher's punishments. There is one student in particular who was put on display in the chess room, potentially for misbehaving. 1984 also used the same tactic of fear to stop behaviors it didn't like. The entire system itself represents a broader system of operant conditioning. After these two sects comes the Ministry of Plenty. This was the economic branch of Big Brother, and their task was to oversee the distributions of goods and food. To me, this organization is best represented by the maw and the hospital. These two areas seem to produce the goods of the system. The maw supplies the proles with food by using forced labor and cannibalizing one another. The same goes with the hospital. This area is seemingly where the masks are created in Little Nightmares. Then there's the Ministry of Plenty, which controlled the narrative by fabricating stats. In Little Nightmares, I have a hard time believing the guests at the maw know they are going to die. To me, it makes more sense that the Ministry of Plenty or the Ministry of Truth incentivize people to go to the maw without knowing the true implications. It's important to note that these systems don't function as well individually. If the truth were up for grabs, then suddenly a fake economy would fall apart. This mechanical system only works because all the parts operate simultaneously. The Ministry of Peace is the only one left. This one is hard because there aren't too many explicit areas that symbolize this sect, but I think the branch is best represented by the background of Little Nightmares. This game doesn't necessarily take place while in war, but there seems to be a good amount of evidence that suggests it does to some extent. The Pale City looks war-torn, like bombings ravaged the area. Also from the descriptions of Oceania, this place reminds me of the areas where the proles reside. And if you take into consideration the countless pieces of Holocaust imagery, it's possible at least that Little Nightmares could take place during a war. Goldstein was a prominent freedom fighter in Oceania, until it's revealed to us later that he was manufactured by the party. In the book, he reveals two things Big Brother hopes to accomplish. The first goal is to control people's thoughts and behaviors. The second is to kill large swaths of people quickly. If we look at Mono and Six, I think that Big Brother accomplished their goal with these two. They both have a part to play, similar to Winston and Julia. The first one of the party is fulfilled by Mono. If Big Brother's goal is to eliminate independent thought, then creating a world of surveillance and media control would be a good way to implement this, to get into people's minds and control all thoughts. The faceless people seem to be byproducts of this consumption, amalgamations, mindless, only serving the messages on screen. Everyone under the control of propaganda that Winston or Mono designed. The second one of the party is fulfilled by Six. If Six is the lady, then the maw would be the logical extension of the wants of Big Brother. The maw is a completely submersible boat with the explicit purpose of murder. It's not necessarily instant like the party wanted, but with one way in and one way out, no means to fight back, everyone who's on the boat is as good as dead once the boat submerges. I think there deserves to be an entire section on the Porcelain Children in Little Nightmares. Tabula rasa is a philosophical and psychological idea about blank slates. Usually this term is used when talking about children. The environment in which a child grows up can drastically change their psychological development. If a child were to live in this fascist dystopia, it would be hard for their brains to cultivate empathy. In 1984, children were often the most zealous when it came to revealing dissenters to Big Brother. They even roleplay as Big Brother. From the beginning, these kids are desensitized to violence. They are the perfect vessel for Big Brother to achieve its ends. Blank slates, too young to question the information fed to them. Newspeak diminishes their capacity for thought, to the point where they are mindless party members. The Porcelain Children greatly resemble the kids in the book. Their heads are empty, unable to think for themselves, unable to function without instruction from the party. The fear is instilled into them so they will listen. Displays are made to show what happens if they even think about stepping out of line. But even without the presence of the teacher or Big Brother, the Porcelain Children, no matter how distracted they get, will always do what they are programmed to do. Turn in and take down dissenters of the party. Not to mention that they aren't human. They resemble children, but they are little monsters created in the image of them. One of the ways the society in 1984 functioned so efficiently was the use of forced labor. People from all over Oceania worked tirelessly as punishment for disobeying Big Brother. So if the Porcelain Children are mimics, then who are the real children? I think that gnomes could be understood as dissenters to the party. Gnomes have the exact same fear as us, the player. The eyes horrify these little creatures, for good reason. No one wants to be killed on sight. Eyes constantly surveying. Very Little Nightmares in particular gives us a lot of insight into the gnomes. We can see how much they fear the watching eyes of Big Brother. They have warnings laid out in salt, writings on walls, and scurry at the slightest noise. I feel like the gnomes give us great insight into how the characters feel under a dystopian rule. We experience a genuine sense of fear when being chased by the eye, sneaking, always hiding, anxious of what's around the corner. If we took this feeling and amplified it 1,000 times, then we would get to understand how Winston, Mono, Six, and Julia feel. Gnomes also demonstrate the oppressiveness of the system. They seem genuinely sad and scared most of the time. Depressing music plays in all of the gnome areas. In one area, we see gnomes with a shrine for their fallen friends. When we combine this with the DLC in the first Little Nightmares, then we get a bigger picture, although they do have fun sometimes too. Generally, this is when they are left to their own accord. I feel like this would be a normal reaction for a child. A chance to get away from forced labor, and they get to be kids for a while. The gnomes themselves appear lifeless in uniform. They wear bland colors, and it's impossible to recognize one from another. To me, the gnomes represent Big Brother achieving its ends. Dehumanization is used to exploit their labor, and in their absence, replacement children. Kids who look like the same on the surface, but inside, no individual thoughts, only emptiness. One of the most pervasive themes in 1984 in Little Nightmares is the sense of isolation. Isolation is a necessary component of radicalization. In the book, Terror, Love, and Brainwashing by Alexander Stein, the author talks about how radicalization in groups work. He asserts that there are three main tenets to brainwashing: isolation, engulfment, and fear. In the book, the members of the party work tirelessly, their entire lives engulfed by the party, isolated because social interaction is highly discouraged and relationships are punished. Fear comes in the form of propaganda that the people of Oceania consume. Fear is a huge motivator in the games. We are engulfed by the game world, constantly running, hiding, no escape, no time to rest or recover. But isolation is especially important in Little Nightmares. I think this sense of solitude is what sets the tone for the majority of these games. These feelings of being helpless, alone, scared, no one to lean on, no one to look to hope for. Isolation is especially pernicious and effective in radicalization. Differences of opinion allow our perspectives to grow, but isolation stops improvement. When we are isolated, our mind is more impressionable. How do we know what's real if no one is there to validate our reality? This is why the party used isolation against Winston. Not only literal isolation, but the isolation of his thoughts. He was one of the only people left not corrupted by the system, similar to Mono. Being alone is what broke Winston. The torture did its work, no doubt, but the feelings of solitude and isolation drove his mind into a corner. When Mono is abandoned by Six, he is away from the last thing keeping him grounded. Isolation radicalizes him. Without a differing perspective or a helping hand, the images on TV become much more digestible. This is also why cults capitalize on isolated people. They are easy targets without a solid support infrastructure to keep them grounded. The world of Little Nightmares itself is meant to isolate. Accidentally bumping into an item can mean death, so it makes more sense practically to travel alone or in small groups. Another thing isolation can do is warp our memories. When we are isolated for long periods, it can sometimes be difficult to recall information. As I said before, memories are complicated, and our brains get rid of memories that it deems unnecessary over time. But when you're alone, the experiences you have can be harder to remember. Memories are in part consolidated by our interactions and experiences with others. We can all remember some events from our childhood. However, without any interactions with friends or family, those memories might not exist now. No one to share the memory with, no reason to talk or think about it, other than your own volition. That's why isolation is so effective at radicalization. These three themes all come from 1984, but map on perfectly onto the world of Little Nightmares. Let's start with doublethink. This term means holding two contradictory beliefs. I don't think doublethink applies to the characters as much as the institutions in the game. Take for example the school or hospital. These are places intended for learning and healing. Even though these two places resemble real-life areas, their goals are different. At the school, the teacher teaches, but she is teaching propaganda to captivate the children's minds. We can't go inside of the enemy's head, but it seems like she is invested in the classroom. When the students get distracted, she smacks her ruler to refocus their attention. But the doublethink comes in the form of learning propaganda. This sentiment is inherently paradoxical, because facts are a direct counter to brainwashing. The same can be said for the hospital area. Usually the goal of medicine is healing, but the doctor uses the hospital to mutilate and harm. This again shows the inherent contradiction that the book discusses. But the doctor and teacher seem genuine in their beliefs. They do all the same actions as a teacher or doctor, performatively the same, but with more heinous outcomes. Newspeak is also present in the game world. In Little Nightmares, Newspeak comes in the form of mind control through televisions. Especially in the Pale City, the world is captivated by televisions. These zealous amalgamations have lost their capacity for thought. They can only follow the pictures on screen. Memory holes also have great significance in 1984. These transport devices would take historical information and burn it. To me, this is represented best at the school. You can see stacks of burning books. Controlling information allows you to control people. If we look at the classroom, it doesn't seem like the children have much at their disposal. The teacher seems like the only one who is dictating what is being taught in class. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. These three slogans are the bedrock of control for INGSOC. All of these phrases are important and require analysis. War is peace essentially means that when there is a constant state of war, people's emotions are much more volatile. Little Nightmares enemies remind me of this first slogan. Whenever there are enemies on screen, there is a feeling of tension, but as we get more familiarized to the enemies, the fear starts to subside. This is why the games constantly transition central bad guys. But War is Peace is true for the enemies as well. The chefs are busy cooking meals for Gordon Ramsay.
That's wrong!
But once they spot us, they go into a frenzy, an almost uncontrollable, zealous rage. This was also true in 1984. They had this practice called 2 Minutes Hate, in which all the citizens in Oceania would react violently to images on screen. People would stir themselves into a cult-like frenzy to show their disdain for Goldstein. Almost all of the enemies do this. Whenever they notice you, they go into a panic until they capture or kill you. Almost like if it's something they've been programmed to do. Freedom is slavery is the second central tenet in INGSOC. The party argued that independence meant the downfall of man. Collectivization was the only way forward. This is something that again maps on perfectly onto the enemies in the games. We face a collective of enemies willing to do anything to survive in the system. As an individual, our power to fight the system becomes diminished. Freedom is slavery could also have another meaning. It could also mean the illusion of free will. This idea that by thinking we are free, we are enslaving our minds by lying to ourselves. If we use this interpretation of the phrase, then I think it could be a poignant message in the games about the illusion of control. As the player, we assume a lot more control than we often have in the games. In the case of Little Nightmares, Mono and Six don't have free will in the plot. We can choose where they walk or what they pick up, but there is only one path forward. These two are enslaved by the system, and by their perceived notion of freedom. But the structures in place are too powerful. Freedom is just an illusion to help the characters cope. The third and final slogan is ignorance is strength. This idea is represented by the Porcelain Children and the people in the Pale City. By twisting these characters' thoughts so much, it seems like they are willing to swallow anything fed to them. The children can't think for themselves. The adults follow the screens mindlessly. The strength in this instance comes from the collective ignorance, unquestioningly following orders, snuffing out whoever Big Brother deems as evil. I think that Mono is Winston and Julia is Six in the Little Nightmares universe. The world is mechanical and structured. Systems of power in place guarantee the party's desired outcome. As the two traverse the world, Big Brother slowly takes hold, always watching, surveying, analyzing, improving the system, making sure that the future mistakes don't happen. The system corrupts Winston and Julia. Ministries elicit full control over the two and break them down. They both get trapped in the system. All they have is each other, but even that gets taken from them. Their most important bond, crushed. Once they are separated, then control becomes easy. Mono becomes the Thin Man, a propagandist who essentially created the world of Little Nightmares, creating the institutions of power. He represents the first one of the party, the ability to control thoughts and have complete omniscience. By creating these structures, he also strips society of its capacity to think for itself, rewriting history, creating television propaganda, and ruling with a heavy hand. Six has a part to play as well, working inside the system, making the second one of the party a reality. The ability to kill en masse, creating the Maw, the perfect death machine, no evidence left behind. In the same way that Winston had to work inside the system, so did Julia. She had to run the anti-sex leagues, even though she was a very sexual person, wanting to be beautiful and idolizing beauty because of the tyrannical oppression of women in 1984. This want manifested itself by wearing the mask of something beautiful, a geisha. Feeling disgusted, she must work in the system, so she hides behind a mask. But Winston and Julia are ultimately rats in a trap, cogs in this mechanical system, ultimately succumbing to Big Brother, giving up their freedom, enslaving themselves to the system, gaining strength in their newfound ignorance, constantly fighting until there is no meaning left in the world, the peaceful bliss that comes from radicalization. Thanks for watching another one of my videos. 1984 and Little Nightmares are powerful pieces of media with a lot to say about society. There are so many poignant messages about radicalization, consumptive behaviors, and systems of control. I think it's important to break down and understand these structures, because once they are in place, it's too late. Educating ourselves about radicalization can be helpful to point out dangerous ideologies in future instances. I also can't recommend 1984 enough. I know that for some people, reading isn't as engaging as playing video games, but there's a lot of value in reading, and it can help contextualize imagery in our favorite pieces of media. I was wondering, let me know down in the comments how many of you would like to have a video game book club. It could be fun to pick a book to read together and compare it to a game series. Let me know your general thoughts or theories surrounding Little Nightmares or 1984. One last thing before I go, for those of you who are still here. If you want for fun, type the phrase I use when talking about long-term memory storage, with an asterisk next to it. Thanks so much, have a good one.